February 8, 1983, 10:30 a.m. Michael Catron, a dino rod plumber, knelt beside an open manhole cover at 23 Cranley Gardens in the Muswell Hill district of North London. The building's residents had been complaining for days about a terrible smell and backed-up drains. Catron expected the usual blockage: grease, hair, maybe some household debris. What he found when he shined his flashlight into the drain was something else entirely. A white, flesh-like substance packed the pipe completely. And bones. Small bones scattered throughout the mass. Catron pulled a piece of the substance out with his gloved hand and examined it closely. It wasn't chicken. It wasn't any kind of food waste. The texture was wrong. The smell was wrong. He'd been a plumber for years and had seen plenty of disgusting things in drains, but this was different. This looked disturbingly human. He called up to his supervisor and showed him what he'd found. They agreed they needed to report it to the police, but it was getting late. They'd come back in the morning to investigate further and call authorities if necessary. Catron returned the next morning, February 9th, with his supervisor, Gary Wheeler. The drain had been cleared overnight. Someone had removed most of the flesh and bones, but when they examined the pipes more closely, they found scraps of tissue still clinging to a pipe connected to the top floor flat, apartment number 3. They also found 4 complete human fingers. Catron called the police immediately. By that afternoon, pathologists had confirmed what Catron suspected. The bones and tissue were human. The flesh showed evidence of ligature marks consistent with strangulation. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and 2 colleagues waited outside apartment 3 for the tenant to return from work. At 5:40 p.m., Dennis Nilsen, 37, a civil servant who worked for the Manpower Services Commission, walked up to his building. The detectives stopped him at the door, identified themselves, and explained they were investigating a drainage problem. Nilsen invited them inside politely. The moment they entered the flat, the smell of decomposition hit them. Thick, unmistakable, the odor of rotting human flesh. Jay looked at Nilsen and asked directly, "Where's the rest of the body?" Nilsen hesitated for only a moment, then pointed to a wardrobe in the corner. "In there," he said calmly, "in 2 plastic bags." Inside the bags, investigators found human remains, torsos, limbs, a head. Over the next hours, as Nilsen was taken into custody and his apartment was searched thoroughly, the full scope of what he'd done became horrifyingly clear. Jay asked him how many victims there were. Nilsen thought for a moment, mentally counting, then replied, 15 or 16, I think. I'm not sure. I didn't keep a record. 15 or 16 young men murdered over 5 years in 2 different North London apartments, their bodies dismembered and disposed of through burning, burial, and eventually, when Nilsen ran out of other options, flushing down the toilet. The question wasn't just how he'd killed so many people. The question was how he'd gotten away with it for so long. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, a small fishing town in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. His father, Olav Magnus Nilsen, was a Norwegian soldier who'd been evacuated to Scotland during World War II after Norway fell to Nazi occupation. His mother, Elizabeth Duthie White, was the daughter of a Scottish fisherman. The marriage was unhappy from the start. Olav showed little interest in family life, and the couple divorced in 1948 when Dennis was 3 years old. Dennis and his siblings, an older brother and a younger sister, were raised primarily by their mother and maternal grandfather, Andrew White, in a small house crowded with extended family. Andrew White was the defining figure of Dennis's childhood. Dennis adored his grandfather, followed him everywhere, helped him with fishing, sought his approval constantly. When Dennis was 6 years old, Andrew died suddenly of a heart attack while out fishing. The death devastated Dennis. But what came next may have been worse. His family took him to view his grandfather's body at the funeral home without adequately preparing him for what he'd see. Dennis later described looking at his grandfather's corpse, pale, cold, lifeless, and experiencing a profound psychological break. The person he loved most in the world was gone, transformed into an object. Death and love became confused in his child's mind. He couldn't articulate it at the time, but that moment created an association between affection and corpses that would define his entire pathology. Dennis struggled through adolescence. He recognized early that he was attracted to men, but in 1950s and 1960s, Scotland, homosexuality was illegal and deeply stigmatized. He kept his sexuality hidden, ashamed and confused. At 14, he joined the Army Cadets, and at 16, he enlisted in the British Army, hoping military structure would give him purpose and perhaps suppress his sexual orientation. He served for 11 years, working as a cook and, significantly, as a butcher. He learned how to dismember animal carcasses, how to separate meat from bone, how to dispose of organic waste efficiently. These skills would later prove useful in ways the Army never intended. Nilsen left the Army in 1972 and briefly joined the Metropolitan Police as a trainee officer. During his police training, he attended morgue visits and observed autopsies as part of his education in forensic procedures. He was fascinated by the dead bodies, by the clinical process of examining corpses, by the way pathologists handled human remains with professional detachment. But police work didn't suit him. He resigned after less than a year and took a job as a recruitment interviewer for the Manpower Services Commission, a government employment agency. It was a stable, unremarkable civil service position that would employ him until his arrest. In 1975, Nilsen moved into a garden flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in the Cricklewood area of North London. He lived there with a younger man named David Galichan for about 2 years. Galichan later insisted their relationship wasn't sexual, but Nilsen clearly viewed him as a romantic partner. When Galichan moved out in 1977, Nilsen spiraled into depression and alcoholism. He'd never been good at maintaining relationships. He was isolated, lonely, socially awkward. He began drinking heavily, spending evenings alone in his flat or cruising gay pubs in central London, seeking connection but unable to sustain it. He later described feeling that people used him for a place to stay or a meal, but didn't truly care about him. He wanted companionship. He wanted someone who wouldn't leave. On December 30th, 1978, Nilsen met a teenage boy in a pub near King's Cross Station. The boy, whose name Nilsen never learned, was young, vulnerable, possibly homeless. Nilsen invited him back to Melrose Avenue for drinks. They talked, drank beer, went to bed. Nilsen later claimed they had consensual sex, though given the boy's age and intoxication, consent was questionable at best. In the morning, Nilsen woke up and looked at the boy sleeping beside him. He described experiencing a sudden, overwhelming panic at the thought of the boy waking up and leaving. He couldn't bear the idea of being alone again, so he strangled him with a necktie while he slept. When strangulation alone didn't kill him quickly enough, Nilsen filled a bucket with water and drowned him. Then he carried the body to the bathroom, filled the tub, and washed the corpse carefully. What Nilsen did next established the pattern he'd follow for the next 5 years. He dressed the body in clean underwear, carried it to his bed, and laid down beside it. He talked to the corpse, watched television with it propped up next to him, stored it under the floorboards when it began to smell, retrieved it periodically to examine it. He later described these interactions as companionship, claiming the dead couldn't reject him, couldn't leave, couldn't disappoint. After 7 months, when decomposition made keeping the body impossible, he burned it in a bonfire in his garden, along with an old mattress and other debris to mask the smell. His neighbors noticed the smoke and terrible odor, but assumed he was burning trash. Nilsen didn't kill again for nearly a year. He later claimed he struggled with guilt after the first murder, tried to convince himself it was an isolated incident, an accident. But the loneliness returned, the compulsion returned. On December 3, 1979, he met Kenneth Ockenden, 23, a Canadian tourist visiting London. Ockenden was different from most of Nilsen's victims. He wasn't homeless or vulnerable. He was employed, traveling for pleasure, with family expecting him home. They spent the day together sightseeing, drinking in pubs, eventually returning to Melrose Avenue. Nilsen strangled Ockenden with an electrical cord while he was listening to music on headphones. He kept the body for 2 weeks, treating it like a companion, before dismembering it and hiding the parts under the floorboards. The pattern accelerated. Martin Duffy, 16, in May 1980. Billy Sutherland, 26, in August 1980. An unidentified victim Nilsen referred to as the skinhead in September 1980. The bodies accumulated under the floorboards and in the cupboards of Melrose Avenue. The smell became noticeable. Nilsen regularly sprayed air freshener and gaseous fluid disinfectant throughout the flat. In the summer of 1980, he began burning bodies in bonfires in his back garden, sometimes multiple corpses at once. He'd build the fire at night, add rubber tires to create thick black smoke that masked the smell of burning flesh, then spend hours the next day searching through the ashes for bone fragments, which he'd crush and scatter. Nilsen's victim selection pattern was consistent. He targeted young men, typically in their teens or 20s, almost always gay or homeless or both. He found them in pubs around King's Cross, Soho, and Charing Cross, areas known for street hustlers, runaways, and the gay community. These were people society largely ignored, whose disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated. Some had no families searching for them. Others had families who'd rejected them for being gay. When they vanished, police rarely prioritized finding them. Nilsen understood this. He later admitted he deliberately selected victims no one would miss. His method was simple. He'd strike up conversations in pubs, offer them a place to stay or a meal, seem kind and helpful. Back at his flat, he'd give them alcohol, wait until they were intoxicated or asleep, then strangle them, usually with a necktie, sometimes with a rope or cord. He'd sometimes drown them in his bathtub as well, ensuring they were dead. Then came the ritual: bathing the body, dressing it, sitting with it, sometimes masturbating over it, storing it, retrieving it periodically. The necrophilia was profound. Nilsen didn't want living partners who could reject him. He wanted corpses he could control completely. 2 men survived encounters with Nilsen. In October 1980, a young Scottish man named Douglas Stewart woke up at Melrose Avenue to find Nilsen strangling him. He fought back, managed to break free, and staggered to the police station to report the attack. The police interviewed Nilsen, who claimed it was a consensual sexual encounter gone wrong. They believed him and didn't charge him. In November 1980, another young man, Paul Nobbs, woke at Nilsen's flat with memory loss and bruising around his neck. He went to a hospital, where doctors noted injuries consistent with strangulation, but he didn't report it to police. Both men had given investigators opportunities to stop Nilsen. Both were dismissed. By late 1981, the situation at Melrose Avenue was becoming unsustainable. The smell of decomposition was overwhelming. Neighbors complained. The landlord questioned Nilsen about the odor. Nilsen claimed it was rotting floorboards. In October 1981, he moved to a new address, a top-floor attic flat at 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill. The new flat was smaller, with no garden and no direct access to outdoor space. Nilsen had lost his ability to burn bodies. He'd have to find a new disposal method. He started dissecting bodies in the kitchen and bathroom, boiling heads in large cooking pots to remove flesh from skulls, cutting corpses into smaller pieces. Initially, he stored body parts in plastic bags and suitcases, but space was limited. Eventually, he began flushing pieces of his victims down the toilet. Human tissue doesn't break down in sewage systems the way Nilsen apparently believed it would. Flesh clogs pipes, bones don't dissolve. By early 1983, the drainage system at Cranley Gardens was completely blocked with human remains. Nilsen killed 3 more men at Cranley Gardens. John Howlett, 23, a guardsman in March 1982. Graham Allen, 27, in September 1982. And finally, Stephen Sinclair, 20, on January 26, 1983. Sinclair was a young man struggling with drug addiction who'd been sleeping rough in central London. Nilsen met him on Oxford Street, brought him back to Cranley Gardens, strangled him while he was unconscious from drugs and alcohol, then dismembered his body and attempted to flush the remains. It was Stephen Sinclair's body parts that finally clogged the drains completely, leading to the Plumbers' call on February 8, 1983. During interrogation, Nilsen confessed comprehensively. He seemed almost relieved to finally discuss what he'd done. He provided detailed accounts of each murder he could remember, though he couldn't recall all the victims' names or exact dates. He described his methods, his disposal techniques, his psychological motivations. He maintained that he wasn't a violent person, that he killed to prevent his victims from leaving, that he'd provided them comfort before they died. Investigators found this self-perception delusional. He'd murdered at least 15 people for his own gratification and convenience. There was nothing compassionate about it. Police excavated both of Nilsen's former residences. At Melrose Avenue, they found bone fragments and ashes in the garden, containing human remains from at least 8 victims. At Cranley Gardens, they found body parts throughout the flat. A skull in a cooking pot, flesh in plastic bags, bones in tea chests. Forensic examination confirmed 15 victims, but Nilsen himself suggested there might have been 16. Only 12 were ever identified. The others remain nameless. Young men who disappeared into Nilsen's flat and were never reported missing, never searched for, never found. Nilsen's trial began in October 1983 at the Old Bailey in London. He was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, the attacks on Douglas Stewart and Paul Nobes. He pleaded not guilty by reason of diminished responsibility, with his defense arguing he suffered from mental abnormalities that made him unable to control his actions. The prosecution argued he was perfectly sane, that his elaborate disposal methods and careful victim selection demonstrated planning and awareness of wrongdoing. Psychiatric evaluations were split. Some experts diagnosed personality disorders, but none found him legally insane. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Nilsen testified in his own defense, describing his crimes in clinical detail, explaining his loneliness, his inability to form lasting relationships, his belief that keeping corpses as companions was preferable to being alone. He showed no genuine remorse. He seemed more interested in being understood than in acknowledging the humanity of his victims. When asked if he felt guilt, he responded that he felt more sorrow for himself than for the people he'd killed. On November 4, 1983, the jury found Nilsen guilty on all counts. Judge Croom Johnson sentenced him to life imprisonment, with a recommendation he serve a minimum of 25 years. In 1994, that recommendation was upgraded to a whole life tariff, meaning Nilsen would never be released. He was transferred to HMP Full Sutton, a maximum security prison in Yorkshire. He spent the next 35 years in prison, writing voluminous memoirs, giving interviews, corresponding with journalists and true crime enthusiasts, always maintaining he'd been misunderstood, that his crimes were a response to societal rejection of gay men, that he was a victim of circumstance. On May 10, 2018, Nilsen complained of severe stomach pains and was taken to York Hospital. Surgeons discovered a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm and operated to repair it. Nilsen survived the surgery, but developed a pulmonary embolism and retroperitoneal hemorrhage. He died on May 12, 2018, at age 72. He'd spent 34 years in prison. The families of his victims expressed relief that he'd finally died, though many noted that he'd lived far longer than the young men he'd murdered. The Dennis Nilsen case exposed catastrophic failures in how British law enforcement responded to missing persons reports, particularly when the missing were gay, young, and economically marginalized. Multiple victims' families had reported them missing. Multiple survivors had reported being attacked. But police didn't connect the cases, didn't investigate thoroughly, didn't take seriously the disappearances of young gay men from vulnerable populations. The assumption was that these young men had simply moved on, run away, or didn't want to be found. This societal indifference enabled Nilsen to kill for 5 years. The case also highlighted the invisibility of certain victims. Of Nilsen's 15 confirmed victims, 12 were eventually identified, but 3 remain nameless. They were young men with no identification, no one searching for them, no families who reported them missing. They entered Nilsen's flat and ceased to exist. Their absence was noticed by no one. This erasure of marginalized lives allowed serial killers like Nilsen to operate with impunity. The victims who were identified included Kenneth Ockenden, Martin Duffy, Billy Sutherland, Malcolm Barlow, John Howlett, Graham Allen, and Stephen Sinclair, names that deserve to be remembered as more than entries in Nilsen's victim count. Psychologists who studied Nilsen identified several contributing factors to his pathology. The trauma of viewing his grandfather's corpse as a child created an association between death and affection. His repressed homosexuality in an era when being gay was criminal led to profound shame and isolation. His military training in butchery gave him technical skills for dismemberment. His narcissistic personality disorder made him incapable of empathy while maintaining a grandiose self-image. His alcoholism lowered inhibitions. But millions of people experience these same factors without becoming serial killers. What distinguished Nilsen was his complete objectification of other people, his belief that his loneliness justified murder, his inability to see his victims as human beings with value independent of his needs. Dennis Nilsen's legacy is the 15 young men who never came home, who died because a lonely civil servant decided his desire for companionship mattered more than their right to live. The plumber who found human fingers in a drain solved the case not through brilliant detective work, but through basic maintenance work. Nilsen's stupidity in trying to flush human remains down a toilet finally ended a killing spree that law enforcement had failed to stop, despite multiple opportunities. The drain blockage wasn't justice, it was accident. And the 3 young men whose names are still unknown remain invisible, erased not just by their killer, but by a society that never looked for them in the first place.